Thanks a lot, Matt. I'm glad to be here. My alternative was a rather dreary trip to Montana where I would have to be bicycling and hiking in the wilderness, so certainly much more exciting to come up to Ottawa. I hope you've enjoyed the pictures of Oregon that we're showing. Most of those pictures I was happy to take. Either on the Oregon coast where I used to live or in the mountains where I now live. You didn't see any pictures of Portland. I grew up in Portland, but I hate Portland today for reasons that I'll get into briefly in my presentation. When I was asked to talk about property rights, there's a lot of things I could cover. I actually have given a 3-hour presentation on this subject, so I had to whittle it down to some topics that I think will kind of cover a lot of different issues, and maybe the question and answer we can get into more in depth. As you are going to hear over and over again, of course, the United States has a constitution that supposedly guarantees property rights, and Canada doesn't. As I'll let you know, just the fact that we have property rights enshrined in our constitution in the United States does not mean very much. Property, however, is a key to a healthy society. Randal de Soto, a Peruvian economist, wrote this book, The Mystery of Capital, published in 2000. I think it's one of the best economics books written in the last 20 years. He notes that owning property is a key to building wealth. If you own a house, you can borrow against that house and use that money to start a small business. And lots of businesses that we think are big businesses today were started initially by 1 or 2 people who borrowed against their house, started the business, and built it up. So property ownership, and I'm going to argue that widespread property ownership is a key to a healthy economy and a healthy society. It also has a benefit in that children in families that own their homes do significantly better in school, even after accounting for things like the education and other things of the parents. The children do significantly better in school than children in families who rent their homes. And I also think that home ownership is an important part of income equality. When large numbers of people are forced to rent for their entire lives, it creates a cycle of poverty that becomes very difficult for them to break out of. Property should not be expensive. Property should be cheap. Home ownership should be cheap. And if it's cheap, you'll get widespread home ownership and you'll get widespread economic opportunities that you won't have if it's expensive. As Randal de Soto himself points out, as recently as a couple hundred years ago, very few people own their homes. Perhaps 1% of people on Earth actually own their homes. And as recently as 25 years ago, only a small minority of households in the world owned their own homes. Canada and the United States, about 65% of people, of households owned their homes, and that was at the top of the ranks worldwide. Then came the fall of the Soviet Union, and we had what was called the Great Giveaway in Eastern Europe and Russia and other countries where they gave or sold housing that had been public housing to people, and so now we have 95% home ownership rates in countries like Lithuania and Estonia and Bulgaria and Hungary because the homes are all given away and they're all now privatized. We can look at other countries today that we don't think of as being wealthy countries. Countries like Brazil and Mexico, and they also have very high home ownership rates. 84% in Mexico, 74% in Brazil. Whereas Canada at 66% and the United States at 65% are now in the middle of the pack. Even China has higher home ownership rates than the United States or Canada. So home ownership has become, if there's a home ownership race, it's a race that we're not winning, and it's a race that by losing, we're going to create serious problems. Now, I think of home ownership as a proxy. We've got excellent data on home ownership. We don't have good data on things like how easy it is to create a small business, how easy is it to start a retail market, how easy is it to build an office development. But we do have good home ownership data, so I'm using home ownership as a proxy for property rights. If it's easy to buy a home, if it's easy to build a home, then you probably have pretty secure property rights. Now it turns out 1,000 years ago, the one place in the world where it was relatively easy to own a home was England. It was the one place in the world where you could have private land ownership as an ordinary person. You did not have to be an aristocrat to own land. That changed with the invasion in 1066 of William the Conqueror. He introduced feudalism to England, declared all the land in the country to belong to him, and then he would parcel it out to his vassals and say, you get to manage this, but you have to pay me royalties for managing the land. One part of England, County Kent, refused to go along with this, and they fought him terribly, and finally he gave up and said, okay, you can own land in Kent. That's the only part in England where you were allowed to own land, and Kent adopted as their motto Invicta, meaning that they were victorious over William the Conqueror in that case. Now it so happened that when the English began settling the New World, the charters that were granted to people to own land in the New World were granted by King Charles, and he happened to be at his castle in Kent at the time that he wrote the charters, and so he said that Kentish rules will apply, which meant that anybody could own land. And it wouldn't just be land owned by the king, it could be anybody who could own it. They could pay a fee and it would be their land. They would no longer have to pay annual royalties to the king. The problem was they still had some rules applied to that land. One rule was called entail. It meant that you could not sell your land, you could only bequeath it, usually to your firstborn son. In some places you could bequeath it to all your sons, but usually it was your firstborn son. Thomas Jefferson, when he was nearing the end of his life, he was asked what his greatest accomplishments were, and he said one of his 10 greatest accomplishments was not writing the Declaration of Independence, not being President of the United States, not making the Louisiana Purchase, but one of his 10 most important accomplishments was the abolishment of entail and primogeniture in the Virginia Constitution. And most of the other states in the United States followed suit, and as a result, it became possible to have widespread property ownership in the United States. That was east of the Appalachian Mountains. West of the Appalachian Mountains, all the land was owned by the federal government, and the federal government was very slow at distributing property to people. There was a man named Thomas Lincoln who was considered one of the wealthiest men in Kentucky because he owned a lot of land, but it turned out he did not have secure title to that land. He lost the title to that land. His son, Abraham, grew up in a very poor family, managed to become president anyway, one of the last people from a working class background to become president of the United States. But because they did not have secure title, his father had lost all of his money. Now with the Homestead Act, it became possible in the United States to own at least 160 acres for a very small amount of money, and this distribution of land, Hernando de Soto believes, enabled the widespread creation of wealth after the Civil War. The Homestead Act was passed in 1870. The United States was a moderately wealthy nation before the Civil War, but it was only after the Civil War that our wealth really grew by leaps and bounds. We don't have good data on Canada, but it's probably not a lot different from the United States. Home ownership rates were actually at their highest in the early 18th century, and then they fell steadily until about 1840, and then they started to pick up after that. Most people in Canada and the United States in the middle of the 19th century were rural. Most rural farmers owned their land, but most urbanites did not own their land. As factories are developed, most people had to live within walking distance of the factory because they didn't have any mechanized transportation, and people who worked in a factory couldn't afford a horse. So they lived within walking distance in fairly high-density settlements, and it became difficult to own your own land in that high-density settlement. And yet the striking thing was, in the late 19th century urban areas, and this is probably true in Canada as well as the United States, working class families were far more likely to own their own homes than middle-class families. Working-class families meaning somebody who had a labor job that required physical labor or repetitive work, as opposed to middle-class families meaning somebody who had a sit-down job requiring thinking rather than repetitive labor. Well, working-class families saw a home as a source of income, not just a place to live. You could grow a vegetable garden in your home and sell the vegetables. You could have backyard livestock and sell the eggs, sell the chicken, sell the whatever. You could build a duplex and rent out part of the duplex and live in the other half. You could take in boarders. There were houses that were recorded in the 1890 census, that a 1.5-story house with an outbuilding that had 5 families and 29 people in them, because they took in so many boarders. You could start a small business in your home. You could do all kinds of things to earn money from your home. And housing was cheap. You could buy a house. This is a house in Chicago. It says for a home for $100. That's the down payment. The house itself would sell for $500 if you did not want sewer and water hookups, $1,000 if you did. And that was a formidable amount of money in those days, and yet working class families could afford to do it. And you can still find these houses. They were built by Samuel Gross, who was the largest home builder in Chicago. He built over 10,000 homes, and he said he never foreclosed on anybody. He always gave people good terms. He had never foreclosed on anybody at all. You can still find his houses in Chicago looking almost exactly the same, although presumably they all have sewer hookups today. But working class families found it valuable to own a home. Middle class families did not, for the simple reason that they did not have any assurance that a working class family would not move in next door. And the taste of working class and middle class families in those days, as today, were completely different. They had different taste in food, different taste in recreation, different taste in music, different taste in a lot of different things, and so they did not want these working class people, many of whom were immigrants, to move in next door, so they rented. So that if somebody they didn't like moved in next door, they could pick up and move. And as a result, middle-class home ownership was very low, well under 10% in the 1890s in urban areas. Now, another thing was happening around 1890 is that in New York City in particular, to a lesser degree in other major metropolitan areas, there were large numbers of people living in very, very dense housing called tenements, where you get not just 5 families to a house, but several families to a room. And the documentation of this horrified people to realize that people are having to live in such crowded conditions and such dirty and unsanitary conditions. And so around 1900, the 2 big questions for housing reformers were, first of all, how do we get people out of these terrible, terrible living conditions and into decent housing? And second of all, how do we make sure they don't move next door to us? Well, you might not be surprised to learn that the second question was answered first. And the original answer came in the form of what are called protective covenants. Now, protective covenants are actually a pretty ancient thing. You would add a restriction to a deed that limited what could be done with the land. William Penn's family did this in Pennsylvania in the 1600s to a land that they had been granted. In 1857, a large development was done in New Jersey that had protective covenants. But the really first successful protective covenants were done by this man, J.C. Nichols, who perfected covenants. Essentially, the covenants that you often see today when you buy a house were perfected by Nichols for his developments in Kansas City, the Country Club district in Kansas City. And in this district, he would sell you a lot, and the covenant said that you had to build on it within a year, and the house that you built had to cost at least $5,000. Now, at a time when a working class house cost $500, $5,000 kept the immigrants out, kept the working class out. Now, he advertised that his lots were exclusive, he didn't necessarily have to have a racial exclusion. It wasn't they were excluding blacks or anybody in particular. They were just excluding working class people who couldn't afford a $5,000 house. Now, the people who lived in existing neighborhoods said, well, how do we get this kind of benefit for us? It's hard to put in protective covenants on everybody's house in the neighborhood. I can put one on my house, but that doesn't guarantee that the next door neighbor isn't going to sell his lot to a working class family. So they came up with the idea of zoning. Zoning was developed to keep working class families out of middle class neighborhoods. That was the original purpose of zoning. In some parts of the United States, it was aimed at keeping black people out. In some parts, it was aimed at keeping Asians out. But whether it was racially oriented or not, the main focus was to keep working class people out. How did they do it? Well, they said, you can't take in boarders. They said, you can't have livestock in your backyard. They said, you can't have in-home businesses. So all the things that made housing valuable to the working class were excluded from zoned areas. And as I say, it doesn't matter who they were after. In some parts of the country they were after one group, in other parts they were after another group. But the main point was they wanted to create income-oriented neighborhoods where only high-income people could be there. Since they zoned entire cities, that meant that working class people were effectively zoned out of the cities. Fortunately, in about less than a month, we're going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the moving assembly line for the construction of Model T Fords. When Henry Ford adopted the moving assembly line on October 7th, 1913, it made the production of cars so inexpensive that he was able to cut the cost of his cars in half and double worker pay, which meant for the first time, working class people could afford to buy the cars that they were manufacturing. So they bought these cars, they moved out beyond the city limits, bought cheap land that had no zoning or regulation, and built their houses on it. As a result, working class home ownership rates continued to rise in spite of zoning, in spite of protective covenants. In particular, after World War II, we saw a 50% increase in home ownership rates in the United States, and I think a parallel increase in Canada. But then about 1960, 1970, it leveled off. Why? Well, the middle class struck back. The middle class declared that widespread home ownership was causing urban sprawl. Now, the Russians say that Americans don't have real problems, so they have to make them up. Urban sprawl is one of those made-up problems. All the problems that are attributed to sprawl either are actually due to non-sprawl, or they're are not really a problem at all. Nevertheless, middle-class people in the United States and Canada came up with the idea of managing urban areas to prevent sprawl. They called it growth management. The idea was that you somehow limit the growth of your urban area, limit where it can grow or how fast it can grow, or both, in order to prevent the evils of sprawl. For example, my hometown of Portland, Oregon drew an urban growth boundary around itself in 1979 that encompassed 24 cities and 3 counties, parts of 3 counties, and outside of the boundary, you're not allowed to build a house on your own land in Oregon unless, and every city in Oregon has an urban growth boundary, and you can't build a house outside of that boundary unless you own at least 80 acres, you actually farm it, and depending on soil productivity, you earn at least $40,000 to $80,000 a year farming it in 2 of the last 3 years. That way, they said, we'll be able to make sure that doctors and lawyers don't become hobby farmers, which would somehow be immoral. As a result, 81% of the people in Oregon are confined to 1.2% of the land. That's all the land that's been developed in Oregon inside the urban growth boundaries. Now, they might slowly expand the boundaries, but it's not going to expand very fast. As a result, they've essentially taken away the property rights of the owners of 98% of the land in the state. The same thing happened in California. This is San Jose. The red line is the urban growth boundary. You can see to the west of the line there's a white area that are other cities, but to the east of the line there are green and brown areas. Those are all farms or open space, but they're excluded from development, and as a result, the amount of land available for housing in San Jose is very limited. California, statewide, California is the most populous state in the United States, of course, but it also has the most concentrated population, most concentrated urban areas. 5% of all the land in the state is urban, and 95% of the people in the state live in those urban areas. No other state is so concentrated, so that 95% of the state is off limits to development. British Columbia is the California of Canada. British Columbia passed a law that in the 1960s it eventually morphed into a province-wide growth management planning law, and as a result, Vancouver, for example, has rendered off-limits 70% of the land inside the urban area to any new development. Province-wide, only 0.4% of British Columbia has been developed, and something like 84% of all the people in the province are confined to that 0.4% of the land in the province, making British Columbia the most concentrated province in Canada, and also the most expensive, as we'll see, probably just about in the world. So, in order to protect areas from development, we end up creating far more problems than we solve. First of all, we take away people's property rights. The owner of this Ontario farm might someday want to subdivide it, maybe divide it among his or her children so that each of them gets a fourth of the land or something. When we put in large lot zoning, when we do other restrictions, we make it difficult for people to do those kinds of subdivisions. And a second problem is that we make housing expensive. This is a 4-bedroom, 2.5-bath, 2,200 square foot home in Houston. It would sell for about $180,000 today. Houston famously has no zoning, but even more important, counties in Texas aren't allowed to zone. And as a result, there can be no growth management planning anywhere in Texas, because even if a city wanted to strictly zone their land, any developer could just go across the city line and do whatever they want in the county area. And so the cities don't regulate land a lot. And as a result, housing is very affordable. So a $180,000 home in Houston would cost twice that in Portland. It would cost 3 times that in Ottawa or San Jose, and it would cost 10 times that much in Vancouver because of Vancouver's strict regulation, which goes back to the mid-1960s. Now, a third problem is not only does this kind of growth management make housing expensive and take away people's property rights, it makes housing prices more volatile. Because what you're doing is you're steepening the supply curve. Where the supply curve would ordinarily have been pretty flat, you made it so steep that a small increase in demand leads to a large increase in price, and conversely, a small decrease in demand leads to a large decrease in price, and so you get property bubbles. We all know about the housing bubble that led to the financial crisis in 2008, but there was no housing bubble in the United States. There were many housing bubbles in cities that had growth management planning. And in cities that did not have growth management planning, there were no housing bubbles. And in fact, if you look at the data carefully, you see that cities with growth management planning, housing prices peaked about 2005 or 6 and then started collapsing. The financial collapse happened 2 years later because of that collapse in prices. In cities that didn't have housing bubbles, housing prices continued to increase until 2009 or 10, and then declined a little bit because of the crisis, but that decline didn't cause the crisis. If we hadn't had growth management planning, we wouldn't have had the housing bubbles, we wouldn't have had the financial crisis. Another problem is that these growth management plans are associated with high unemployment rates. Why is that? Because it's expensive to move when your house is expensive. It's expensive to move when you're underwater. It's expensive to move when the realtor is going to take 6% of a $1 million home instead of 6% of a $180,000 home. And so in areas with no growth management, areas of high home ownership have high employment rates, and you find the unemployed people renting. In areas with growth management, you find the high unemployment rates in areas of high home ownership, because home ownership becomes a barrier to the free movement of labor to places with more jobs. This is from a paper by Harvard economist Edward Glaser and Wharton Business School economist Joseph Giorco. They noticed that when you create these growth management areas, you end up creating what they call boutique cities catering only to the elite. In other words, as urban planners say, we're attracting the creative class of people. But in fact, what they're doing is they're pushing out the poor people to make it look like the only people who are left are rich. These numbers probably apply to Vancouver as well as to San Francisco. As you can see, nationwide in the United States, about a third of American households earn less than $50,000 a year, a third earn about $50 to $100, and a third earn over $100,000 a year. But in San Francisco, and I suspect Vancouver, well over half of all families earn over $100,000 a year, because the lower income people have moved farther away where they can afford to buy a house, and then end up either moving their jobs or they commute very long distances. Now, how does all this stuff happen in the United States, where we supposedly have constitutional protections for property rights? That constitutional protection is in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which says, almost as an afterthought, nor shall private property be taken for public use without compensation. Now, the interpretation of that in the 19th century was you can't take private property for private use. You can take it for public use, like a road or a school, only if you compensate the owner at fair market value. Well, the American Planning Association promotes a book by a land use attorney named Eric Freifogel, the book is titled The Land We Share. Well, living in Oregon where half the land is federal, I think that must be the land we share, but no, he's talking about the land we used to call private property. He says that private property is an institution that evolves, that any time, at the whim of the people, we can change what your property rights are and declare that you no longer have a right that you had yesterday. And the Supreme Court has unfortunately gone along with this. In 1915, the city of Los Angeles annexed some land that included a brickyard, and they said, we want to make your brickyard residential, so we're going to make it illegal for you to make bricks on your brickyard. They took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yep, making bricks is a nuisance, it creates lots of smoke, you don't want to hurt next door neighbor property values, so they can just shut you down. A few years later, a city in Ohio wrote a zoning code that said you can only have single-family residential in certain neighborhoods, you can't put multifamily there, and a realtor took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yep, multifamily housing brings down the property values of single family, and so because you might have the nuisance of having poor people or working class people live next door to middle class people, we're going to exclude multifamily housing from these neighborhoods. That's okay. So it's all built around nuisances. It's built around the idea that you could pollute, that you could have burglaries, thefts, crime, whatever, until 1976, when the Penn Central Railroad wanted to build a skyscraper on top of Grand Central Terminal in New York City. They didn't want to alter the terminal except putting the skyscraper on top of it. Actually, the original design for the terminal called for a skyscraper to be built on top of it, but they never got it done. So they proposed to build it. New York City said, nope, we have a historic preservation ordinance, you can't do it. So they took that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, in this case, there's no nuisance involved. There's no trespass. It's surrounded by skyscrapers. It's not like it's going to hurt anybody. But just on the whim of the city to declare it historic property, okay, we're going to take away your rights. You can still use it as a train station, but you can't put a skyscraper on it. Now, of course, by the time they made this decision, the Penn Central Railroad had gone bankrupt because the train station was losing money, and everything else it was doing was losing money. The interesting thing is, the Supreme Court specifically said because they had written a comprehensive plan that it was okay to overlook the requirement of the Constitution. If you go back to the 1927 decision about the Ohio zoning law, they also referred to the fact that the city had written a comprehensive plan. Now, my organization, the Cato Institute, has published this book called The Dirty Dozen, the 12 Worst Supreme Court Decisions, and Penn Central is one of the 12 worst. Most recently, we've had the Kelo decision in New London, Connecticut, where Suzette Kelo owned a house. She was in a working class neighborhood, and a developer wanted to redevelop it into a middle class neighborhood, and they said it would pay higher taxes than working class families would pay, so the city wanted to take her land and give it to the developer. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you can do that because you've written an economic development plan. So what the Supreme Court is doing is it's anointing urban planners with this omniscience that they know what's best for the world, for the city, and since they know what's best, then that can just overcome what the constitutional requirement is. Unfortunately, as this little cartoon, which I found in a book published by the American Planning Association, points out, good intentions are not enough. You actually have to succeed. It turns out in New London, they bulldozed Suzette's house and all the houses next to her, gave it to the private developer, who then changed his mind, and today that land is a dump because it's not valuable for anything anymore. So the fact that you've written a plan doesn't mean anything, and yet the Supreme Court has warped our understanding of property rights in the United States from private property cannot be taken for private use and can only be taken for public use with compensation to, if you write a comprehensive plan, you can take it for private use, and you can take it for public use without any compensation at all if you take it by regulation. If you regulate it so heavily that nobody can do what they want with their land. So as a result, that enabled places like Oregon to say to the owners of 98% of the state, you can't do anything with your land except farm it, and you can't even farm it in many cases because it's not viable. If you want to put a produce stand up on your land, you have to meet very strict requirements about what you can sell because we don't want you selling anything that you didn't actually grow, etc., etc. And it's all because, at the whim of the people who live in the cities, they've decided the countryside is more valuable as scenic beauty to them than it is to the residents and the owners of that countryside. Well, I get into these issues in a lot more detail in my book, American Nightmare. I just happen to have a few copies with me if you want them. Cato sells them for $26. I'm selling them for $20. Honesty compels me to tell you that you can buy an electronic version for about $13, but that won't have my autograph, which must be worth at least $7, especially if you try to resell it on eBay. You can also go to the Cato Institute's website, cato.org, and I've written a lot of different papers on the subject of housing and urban planning and property rights. I have a blog that I try to post to several times a week called The Anti-Planner. Just Google Anti-Planner and I'm the first thing on the list. In the United States, we're going to have a national conference on property rights and transportation issues in Washington, D.C. in about a month and a half. It's going to be October 27 and 29. We've got at least one Canadian signed up already. It'd be nice to see a few more because these property rights are an issue worldwide, not just in the United States. A couple of websites if you're interested in more information. Do we have time, and does anybody have any questions?